We're so used to the story of Jesus being considered God that most people today have never paused to wonder how in the world such a belief could have come out of the staunchly monotheistic Judaism of the first century. We're simply too familiar with the story of Jesus that changed the world. It does not seem as revolutionary to us today that the Messiah appeared as a peasant, suffered, got himself executed, and has been absent from public view ever since. At least not as revolutionary as it would have been to the first century Jew. This tale has been all too familiar to Christians since the first couple of centuries had passed after Jesus' death. But imagine you're one of the earliest church fathers writing a defense of such Christian doctrines, and you'll quickly see what a monumental task it is, and just how revolutionary Christianity actually was. And what was the most revolutionary teaching that Christianity brought on the world? I would argue that it was not that the Messiah had come, or even that he had come as a suffering servant, conquering death by being killed. No, I would argue that it was the new teaching that this Son of God was also God and worthy of worship, while still maintaining the monotheism of Judaism. How did faithful monotheistic Jews believe that they were supposed to worship Jesus in addition to God, and yet keep their monotheism? Most modern Christians would probably think that they have the key to this mystery, that it is simply a matter of understanding the Trinity. But there is no such explanation found in the writings of the first and even the second century. Based on their own writings, then, how are we to understand the authors of the New Testament? How did they make sense, to the extent that they did, of what modern scholars are now calling binitarian worship? I'd like to begin this lesson with getting a potential misconception out of the way, so that what follows can be quite relevant both to unbelievers and believers. Naturally, for many believers, the idea that a religious belief, quote-unquote, developed seems counterintuitive to the idea that revelation simply appeared in the world through the pens of inspired men, without them having any imprint on the message whatsoever. I think I've thoroughly disproved such an idea of inspiration in previous lessons and in my book, showing that if a God inspired any part of the Bible, it was through very earthly conduits, vessels of clay, us mere humans. But even if I'm wrong about this, the idea that even true religious ideas, developed in some sense, need not be at odds with fundamental views. For instance, the New Testament itself presents an unveiling of the Hebrew Bible, as we've seen in previous lessons. That itself is quite a development of monumental proportions. And the book of Acts depicts the spread of the gospel through the world. This is geographic development of Christianity. Acts and other books also present misconceptions being clarified even among faithful believers. This also is development of revelation. Paul often finds himself having to explain finer points of doctrine that his congregations had misunderstood. This too is development in the collected books of Revelation as the church grew both in number and in understanding. Larry Hurtado, today one of the most influential scholars on the subject of the earliest development of Christ worship, does what I believe is a decent job explaining too how a doctrine so key as Christ worship could develop in a sense that would probably be accepted to even some fundamentalists, which I will not rehash here. He is on record as a professing Christian, but even if you do not agree with his explanation, I do not think it will be a barrier to understanding any of what follows. He also points out that historical critical secular scholars are also making the same error by concluding that Christ worship must have simply been adapted from the polytheism of paganism. In other words, they are also not investigating the evidence for the historical development of Christ worship. And I too have a simple theory as to their reasoning. They conclude as given that Christ worship could not possibly have occurred as early as the actual evidence suggests in the monotheistic setting of Judaism, evidence which we'll get to. Therefore, they ignore the earliest evidence. Thus, by not considering how Christ worship actually historically developed, believers and unbelievers alike are missing out on better understanding what is arguably the most transformative event in human history, the greatest story of all time. Greatest in the sense of both its influence and its effects on the hearts and minds of billions of humans for millennia. In the following lessons, we'll consider the earliest evidence and possibly get glimpses of how such a thing could be, for never had any Jew spoke like the New Testament writers spoke about their Messiah, at least not explicitly. In my book, I cover a shift in more modern scholarship away from viewing Christianity as a maturation of Judaism, or even as a daughter religion. Even as scholarship became increasingly secular, scholars have often been influenced by Christian notions, such as some fairly radical forms of supersessionism, which saw the Old Testament as inferior in its understandings and the New Testament as superior and more spiritual. To better understand the earliest Christianity, though, we must first understand it as a Jewish phenomenon, for they were Jews. And as we'll see, nowhere is this more important than when we try to understand how Jesus became considered God. In the last quarter of the 19th century, biblical scholarship was very close to the inflection point where it would cease to be predominantly theological, but would become even more secular. Just as had been done with the scientists' search for naturalistic origins of species on Earth, so biblical scholars sought for naturalistic developments of the text of the Bible. Germany at the time was in the forefront of scientific, philosophic, and intellectual development, and so we find most renowned Bible scholars to accomplish this great shift were German ones, such as Hermann Gunkel, considered by many to be the founder of form criticism, and Julius Wellhausen, whom I cover in my book regarding the documentary hypothesis of how the Torah came to be. One of the major new paradigms under which these influential scholars operated was called by the German expression Religionsgeschichtliche Schule, which means the history of religion school, which is the expression I'll be using going forward. Instead of accepting the Bible as simply dropped from the sky whole, scholars sought evidence of how the cultural and historical milieu of the times affected the development of the ideas and documents of the Bible. And one of the most influential scholars to look through the lens of the history of religion school to the topic of how Jesus became considered God and worthy of worship was Wilhelm Bousset, yet another German, in his seminal work Kyrios Christos, with Kyrios being from the Greek word for Lord, which was a term also applied to God in the Septuagint. It was originally published in 1913, but it laid the foundation for what became mainstream biblical scholarship's view on this topic for most of the rest of the century, and it is still quite influential. As a pioneer in trying to see Christ worship in its historical setting, there is much scholarship in Kyrios Christos that bears considering, but like any prototype, it also has several flaws, as we'll see, some of which continue to be influential in modern scholarship, despite being thoroughly disproved. I would here love to cite multiple examples of how modern scholarship continues to hold on to misconceptions even after they've been disproved, or at least seriously questioned, like the Mandela effect, but not explained based on the fact that the people who believe the misconception are laypeople, unstudied in the field in which they have the misconception. I have quite a collection now, but I must curb my interest in this topic and give only a few examples so that we can return to the topic at hand. The Qumran documents were not widely available to the public or even to scholars until decades after their discovery. During that time, all sorts of theories regarding their nature cropped up, including that they belonged to the Essenes. Professor Rachel Elior is on record as presenting excellent evidence that they were from an entirely different community and that their content does not match up with the beliefs and practices of the Essenes. Yet you can continually see remarks in scholarly works that attribute these documents as produced by the Essenes without any mention that the evidence for this is quite mixed, if not very deficient. Another excellent example of scholars falling victim to the Mandela effect, despite often being well studied in the subject matter that they get wrong, is presented by Christine Hayes. It is widely repeated in scholarly writings that Jewish theologians of the early rabbinic period recognized the Noahide laws as universal for the Gentiles. But this idea is actually not found among rabbinic works until the medieval period. And it is widely repeated in scholarly works that the temple of Jesus' day only allowed an aniconic coinage to be used in the temple, following Mosaic prohibition against graven or carved images. But this is simply not the case. Not only did their Tyrian shekel have an image of the emperor on one side, but a pagan god on the other. They used it because it had a relatively stable silver content. To be fair to scholars, who are but humans, there's a certain degree to which we are doomed to repeat errors. I myself am a generalist, relying on and synthesizing thoughts from the valuable works of specialists in their fields. So I have to be especially careful not to let scholarly accepted error creep into my work. But a certain amount is inevitable, since my field of study is much broader in scope than a specialist, forcing me to rely on the specialists. But there is a much worse type of error that is repeated until it is believed. A common misconception is understandable, since we are fallible and short-lived. But the worst error is to repeat something that is quite obviously an accepted fact only within a particular school of thought or even location. without at least some due diligence to verify it, especially when one of the consequences of rejecting it meets with extreme disapproval. That should be a red flag. Professor Elior alludes to just such a reaction in the lecture I just cited. It occurs in sectarian denominations, like the ones in which I was raised. But people are people, so it also occurs in the halls of academia. Yes, there are parallels between radical fundamentalists and secular groups, including supposedly scientific ones. One of the best explanations of this that I've found is by psychologist Professor Jordan Peterson with his zebra story. Briefly, the story is that scientists who studied zebras had a hard time keeping up with which was which, so they got the bright idea of marking one that they were trying to study. The problem with this was that the lions would then kill the one they marked. What they discovered was that the zebra's camouflage was not against the grass, but against the herd. Lions, as pack hunters, could best hunt an animal that they could identify as unique, not necessarily weaker or slower, as previously thought. For the zebras, if you don't blend in, you die. There's a similar phenomenon in academia and other groups of humans, where if you don't go along with the accepted norms, you are singled out even by your own people, and can be vilified and even ostracized. I think this phenomenon is at least part of the explanation for how smart, educated people can hold beliefs in light of strong evidence to the contrary, even for decades. It's also interesting that this phenomenon is evidence of sociological forces squeezing up a bell curve toward consensus, without which we might have a much flatter, eclectic, and even productive variety of viewpoints to draw from. In other words, we humans make ourselves dumber as a race. We have myriad psychological and sociological forces working against us in the search for knowledge and wisdom, some of which can be quite complex by their nature. But there are much simpler ones, some of which are not external at all, but internal. For example, there's the common tendency to look only for evidence that supports what we want to believe, or that which, quote-unquote, must be true, and we thereby often ignore even quite obvious evidence to the contrary. Studies have shown that hearing preaching to the choir, to which we belong, gives us a dopamine surge, so one might even argue that stupid is hardwired into us. And I believe that scholars were not immune to such forces when they created the History of Religion school in regard to its view of how Jesus came to be considered God, the main subject to which we finally return. Bousset's highly influential Kyrios Christos assumes that Christ worship only occurred once Christianity spread to the pagan polytheistic Gentiles, beyond the monotheistic Jewish Palestine. In other words, their contention was that Jesus only came to be considered God under pagan influence, and it was not a Jewish idea. Despite this idea that the Christian view of Jesus as God only occurred after the Gentiles influenced it with their polytheism, Bousset is forced to conclude that this had to have happened extremely early, as Paul was obviously converted to this view within only a couple of decades after the crucifixion, and his writings exhibit quite strong language regarding Christ's divinity. Bousset argues that the earliest Christianity within Palestine viewed Jesus as the Son of God, a widely accepted title for the figure who would usher in the eschaton, the end time, but not as God worthy of worship. There's also a strong debate of whether the Son of Man was a widely known title in Palestine and what was meant by it. I believe that Bousset's arguments were so appealing and continue to be influential even today because scholars often assume that one of the core tenets of Christianity, that Jesus was somehow God, had to have developed over time and not from a monotheistic source, the Jews. It surely had to have come from polytheistic Gentiles.
Surely.
To be fair to their position, to imagine otherwise is quite incredible, as we'll see. But the problem is that there's just so much evidence to the contrary, much of which Bousset and scholars even to this day continue to ignore. But many scholars today finally accept that Paul's early views of Christ as divine preceded him, and therefore went back to the earliest Christians, as we'll see. A new shift in modern scholarship on the subject of the earliest development of Christ worship largely occurred as the result of Larry Hurtado's One God, One Lord in 1988. He's one of the most cited scholars on the topic in the books I've read, written by some of the most prominent names in the field of New Testament scholarship today, such as Bart Ehrman's How Jesus Became God and Michael Peppard's The Son of God in the Ancient World. Hurtado has sometimes been viewed as anachronistically retrojecting Orthodox Christianity back too far, and as we'll see, scholars of the 21st century have not completely given up some of the concepts found in Kyrios Christos. Nevertheless, scholars now speak of a new history of religion school. For Martin Hengel, at least, that is Hurtado's One God, One Lord. but others have used the expression in other works that come to similar conclusions around the same time, such as Jarl Fossum. Now, mainstream scholars finally focus on one of the most important questions regarding the birth of Christ worship. How could this be a Jewish phenomenon? We should at least mention a few of the pieces of evidence that the New History of Religion school began to accept that made them the new version of the school. What they finally accounted for regarding the fact that Christ worship began as a Jewish idea and not as the Gentiles influenced Christianity spread. Many of these will be developed more fully in later lessons. Some of the best evidence is right there in Paul. Despite presenting us with a new understanding of the Messiah as worthy of worship as God, he does so in a thoroughly Jewish context. Paul's use of Kyrios for Jesus, of course suggesting his divinity, is not a Gentile innovation, but had been used by Greek-speaking Jews for God in their scriptures for at least a couple of centuries. And Lord had also been used in Aramaic, which Paul also uses without translation in 1 Corinthians 16:22, as if the expression were common enough even among Greek-speaking believers that he need not even translate it from the Aramaic. Paul also uses Kyrios to refer to Jesus by actually alluding to passages from the Hebrew Bible, as we've already seen. Although the expression Son of God did not necessarily indicate divinity in the Hebrew Bible, Paul also uses this very Jewish expression to show the distinct nature of Christ in connection to the Hebrew Bible, not pagan ideas. But Paul uses Kyrios more to show Christ's divinity, whereas pagan views of men as divine focuses more on sonship. There's also some fascinating evidence that Paul might have incorporated some early traditions about Jesus' lordship in his writings, which we'll consider later. Further, scholars now recognize not only how early Christ devotion occurred, but also how explosive it was. There was not time for secondary development or outside influence, not just because it was such an early development, but because it was already so ubiquitous. We'll come back to more evidence for this. In other words, the old history of religion school was found to be anti-historical. It literally ignored evidence that had been available since the first century. Paul had been there all along, just as when Martin Luther quote-unquote discovered his teachings of faith versus works. Of course, the Gospels were only considered as sources of truth until moderns decided they were mostly devoid of historical merit. But as we'll consider in a moment, they too can tell us things about Jesus, even from the perspective of a modern skeptic. As I've argued, Christ devotion is perhaps the most critical development before we can understand how both the Hebrew Bible and the New Testament essentially conquered the whole world, with an eternal reign over the thoughts of men that is still present, despite the continued secularization of society and education. And there are a handful of reasons why it is most critical that we understand this phenomenon. The first is that Christ devotion happened incredibly early among Jesus' followers, even before Paul, as we'll see in a moment. And secondly, even though we can find different views of the nature of Christ's divinity in the earliest writings we have, as occurs till today, the core view of Christ as God and worthy of worship is positively ubiquitous among the earliest Christ followers. It was everywhere. This was not simply a phenomenon that finally won out in later centuries, as other aspects of so-called proto-orthodoxy did. No, Christ devotion was everywhere from virtually the very beginning. Thirdly, there was no corollary in the ancient Roman world to which we can somehow compare Christ devotion. Yes, of course, they believed in sons of gods, and the view of the Roman emperor as divine, and the Son of God did in fact occur right before Jesus. But what happened with Jesus is not the same. Centuries after the life of Augustus, we'd be hard-pressed to find influential Augustus cults. And slightly later, Mithraism, which became fairly popular among the Romans, and which seemed to have some analogs with Christianity, would not endure. One question I want to examine further in a later series is how ancient myths were similar to the stories of the Hebrew Bible, especially the ones which would be relevant to understandings of who Jesus was believed to be. I also intend to examine some ancient mystery cults that had very peculiarly similar practices to those of the Christians, especially related to communion and the story of the dying God who is resurrected. But here it's enough to point out that Jesus' worship cannot be traced back to, say, a mix of Dionysius cult that James and Paul somehow got involved in on the outskirts of Jerusalem. Despite curious overlapping details of both Christ worship and the stories of the Hebrew Bible with pagan sources, what the Jews who followed Jesus produced was still very unique for their time, indeed for all time. And fourthly, perhaps most importantly, early Christ worship was remarkable for a reason that bears a little more explaining. Y'all know how I love a good circuitous route to a good point rather than linear. Modern scholars, especially New Testament ones, have a particularly interesting criterion to determine if they're going to consider something historical, along with others, of course. This standard basically says that if a detail isn't something the New Testament writers would have made up, then it meets the standard of what they call dissimilarity, because that's such a descriptive term for the concept. It's easy to illustrate. For example, most modern scholars say that John the Baptist probably actually baptized Jesus because that seems like an embarrassment to early Christians, since in theory the superior baptizes the inferior. Perhaps later I'll explain what I view as both the merits and the deficiencies of the criterion of dissimilarity, but here I just want to use it to illustrate another concept. No, I'm not going to examine the early development of Christ devotion using dissimilarity, as it's pretty much accepted. What I'd like to illustrate is what might be called a corollary to dissimilarity. When something is hard to explain, but you keep it in your holy writings, it's one thing. But when you make it perhaps the most important core doctrine of your entire religious and worldview, it's quite another. And that is exactly the case with Christ worship. In the few centuries after the crucifixion, as we'll see in a later lesson, Christians positively had fits trying to explain something so seemingly paradoxical as how they could worship Jesus and God and yet still be monotheists. Their biggest debates were focused on this topic, and they could not move on from them until the doctrine of the Trinity was somewhat established. Not only that, but as other believers in Christ were proposing other more quote-unquote logical paradigms with which to view Christ, those who followed what would become proto-orthodoxy doubled down on yet more paradoxical teachings as they did so. Again, we'll come back to this in a later lesson. This is perhaps the biggest question of the biggest thing to ever happen to humanity. How in the cosmos could Christ worship have become the most important and critical doctrine to ever shape the world? And yet it cannot be even logically explained. Indeed, no man ever spoke like this, at least until Jesus' earliest followers came along. How did this belief suddenly appear? And how did it persist at all, much less dominate the world? How did Christians come to conclude and understand that the folly of God was wiser than the wisdom of men? And how did this foolish gospel bear fruit and grow all over the world so suddenly? Before we move on, I should point out one more thing about Christ devotion. Great minds have struggled with how it is to be explained or believed, and yet it was the essence of the gospel for some New Testament writers, especially John. It was a matter of spiritual life and death, far more important than mere physical life or death. How much more a struggle for the common man? How can the fate of one's eternal existence depend on such a key and difficult doctrine? Such questions point to the differences between the bases for logical conclusions versus questions of faith, which moderns see as sharply mutually exclusive realms of quote-unquote knowing. But I would argue that it is not so bereft of nuance as that, though this is a topic I want to dissect elsewhere. Indeed, maybe Plato himself, a poet, was wrong that we cannot learn from poets, as Wordsworth testifies that the modern quote-unquote scientific mind, with its meddling intellect, misshapes the beauteous forms of things. We murder to dissect. Here I just want to point out that the common man without philosophical training or the best quote-unquote education that civilization has to offer to all those quote-unquote great thinkers who have argued for or against the basis for Christian Christ devotion for the past 2 millennia has probably had much less trouble accepting Christ as Lord. And there have been far more common men than the quote-unquote educated ones throughout history. And often, common men have been far wiser about being more decent human beings than those who had the luxury to learn and pontificate their wisdom to the world and posterity, much of which was so wise that it has since fallen into the dustbin of history, never to be reprinted or not read by many. What if sometimes at least the wisdom of being a decent human being, or, gasp, the ability to have faith and even humility or peace are the greater evidence of knowledge and wisdom? What if an eternal soul judgment could indeed be justly based on such criteria for accepting divine truths, which cold logic alone fails to fully prove? Wait, did I just use logic to suggest that logic is only the beginning of wisdom, not the end? Seems like something only the most logical mind, tainted by being half human, would say. I'll end this philosophical aside with a quote from Morris Bishop's book on the Middle Ages. The average peasant of the Middle Ages had a perfect, unquestioning faith in God and the kindly saints. If he suffered man's injustice, he had only to wait a little for the hour when all wrongs would be righted for eternity. He could not judge the system into which he was born. It was as imperative as the cycle of the seasons, the cycle of life, toil, mating, decay, and death. Now let's turn to evidence for the earliest Christ worship, and we'll start as far back as we can. Let's see that the evidence that a man could become a god was already in the Hebrew Bible in the next lesson.